My name is Larry Crandall. I was in the Foreign Service for some 32 years, including many interesting hotspots around the world. And the story I want to talk about today is Afghanistan, which I've had a very long association with in several different ways. It goes back to about 1974, the chaos in Afghanistan. At that time, the king, Zaire Shah, had gone to Rome for dental treatment, and his cousin, Daoud, decided that he didn't want the king on seat anymore, so he told the king not to come back or he'd shoot him. And the king stayed in Rome for many, many years after that, needless to say. That began the chaos in Afghanistan, the political chaos. There were two factions of the Communist Party at that time, the Kaukis and the Parchamites. The details about what each believed are not so important as the fact that neither one could get along, and their backers in Moscow were very upset that their communist brethren were fighting each other more often than getting along. So on Christmas Eve, 1979, the Soviets decided to sort things out militarily, and they sent several thousand people across the border from Central Asian countries, then republics of the Soviet Union, and got to Kabul as quickly as they could by road, and they did sort things out rather quickly, killing any number of people and installing their stooge at the head of the government. That coincided with the time that my wife and I were assigned there, 75 to 77, and it was almost impossible to get anything done with the government. It was just frozen into inaction. Everybody was afraid of everybody else. I remember once we had met some very nice Afghans we wanted to invite for a social occasion, and they said, if we accept, we have to tell the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and if we tell them, then they'll likely put us in jail, so we probably won't come to your social occasion. Thank you very much. That just gives you a sense, in a limited way, of how things were 75 to 77. Come 1979, as I said, the Soviets had invaded, and what they did not expect, what got the full brunt of, was a national uprising by tens of thousands of mostly farmers and peasants of various kinds around the country. They did not like the idea of a foreign power entering their country uninvited. It was pretty basic at first. You know, guys had old muzzle loaders and whatnot, but they were fearless, and they organized in various ways, which caused the Soviets to bring in ever more troops, rising up to about a total of 115,000 at its peak, as I remember. They brought in a large contingent of Hind aircraft, Hind helicopters, their famed gunships, and other bombers of various kinds. At first, they were afraid to go out into the countryside because they didn't understand it. They didn't know what they were up against, and so they just did everything by air and just did wanton bombing all over the place, killing tens of thousands of people, literally. That bombing led to the widespread growth of the refugee problem. Some 3.5 million Afghans moved over to Pakistan, and upwards of 1 million went over to Iran on the other side of the country, which created a certain amount of difficulty for us because in 1980, Carter signed the first national security directive providing $15 million in covert money to the agency for supplying weaponry and training to the Mujahideen. And that program eventually grew to the largest covert program anywhere in the world up until that time. It was an enormous thing, and I watched the growth of it up close and personal for several years. The Mujahideen did a pretty good job of fighting the Soviets between 80 and 84, 85, but they were equally interested in fighting each other. When the organization was first brought to the Mujahideen by our ISI, our Pakistan intelligence counterpart, and the other folks who ran the covert program, they found that there were 84 different political parties that had formed in the refugee camps, all of whom were anxious to fight the Soviets. But you can imagine trying to work with 84 separate groups, neither one of whom wanted to work with the other. Our friends in the Pakistan government managed to winnow that down to 7 and created a whole lot of disgust on the part of the Afghans along the way, partially because of the heavy-handed way in which they did it, but that's another story. Come 84, as I said, we were relatively happy with the way the Afghans were fighting, but they were fighting each other way too much, and we wanted them to get focused and more clear-eyed about what they were doing. I was asked to lead a team to go out to Pakistan to write a strategy to develop a non-lethal component to our effort out there on a fairly large scale. And so I was the team leader. There were 2 State Department guys who were with me, and we spent 6 weeks out on the border, Peshawar down to Quetta and just about every place in between, talking to every Afghan we could find who was willing to talk to us. And some were not willing to talk to us, I might add. Some who've come to international notice, by the way, I won't go into that. That's another long story. We spent those 6 weeks out there. I holed up in the consulate for the last week, putting the final touches on the report. Came back and to D.C. and went through a whirlwind of interagency reviews of it. And what happened was everybody could see that what I proposed was basically the nucleus for the beginnings of a government, an Afghan government in exile. And we started talking about that in those meetings. I didn't want to put it in the report because I was afraid people would think I was going too far. But didn't matter. They saw what it meant, and so that's basically what it became. I had to go back out to Pakistan because I didn't put a budget in the strategy because I didn't want the budget wallahs to get uptight about a budget for a political program that we hadn't tried to do in a very long time, and we didn't really know what would happen. So I just didn't want to get into budget discussions with people. So once I got the strategy agreed to, which by the way included a near briefing of Secretary of State Schultz, I went up to the 7th floor. I was supposed to brief him. My political boss didn't want to go. He said Secretary Schultz scared him and I had to go by myself, which I found interesting. I had met Schultz in a different setting sometime later. I didn't find him scary at all. But at any rate, I went up and I walked into his office and he said, "You're Larry?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Yeah, I don't want your briefing." He said, "We're going to do it." He said, "You just go back and start making things happen." And I said, "Well, it's not really that simple. You know, there's a whole lot of organization that needs to be done." He said, "Well, you take care of that crap. I don't want to do it. I don't want to get involved in it, but just see that it happens." So that's what I told my political boss when I got back, and all of a sudden things started happening. The most important step that I had to take at that point was to go up and see Congressman Charlie Wilson from East Texas, who went on to great fame in a movie that was called Charlie Wilson's War, after a book by George Crandall, whom I knew very well as well. Charlie was a real character. He's about 6'6", skinny as a beanpole, and loudmouth, foul mouth, drinking, womanizing kind of person, not necessarily in that order. Interesting guy. I walked into his office, and he said, "I've seen enough of you pink-cheeked bureaucrats to last a lifetime, and here's another one. I don't really want to talk to you, but I will. I don't think you're going to do a goddamn thing when you're out there, but I'm going to keep close track of you, and if you do, then I'm willing to talk to you again." So that was how that meeting went, not really well. I was, at that point, already starting a new assignment to the National War College at Fort McNair, and I was very excited about it, and I wanted to do it. But Ambassador Hinton out in Pakistan told me no, I wasn't going to go to the War College, that he was going to see to that. But I told him I was, and we had a big argument about it. He won that argument. My orders were changed, and I went to Pakistan as quickly as I could get sorted out and out there. Okay, let's get into some more interesting things. I got there in early September of '85, and the only money that could be scrounged up at the end of the fiscal year, which ended on September 30th, was $15 million, and nobody thought I could get that obligated by September 30th, by which time it would be lost, because it, by law, had to be obligated by then. I managed to get a couple of non-competed contracts in place very quickly and dumped the money in the two of them. And so that money was not lost. Then, a couple months after that, I was back in Washington on consultation, and Charlie asked to see me. He said, "You're doing all right. I'm going to start giving you some serious money now." So all of a sudden, he started working his ways in Congress, and we started getting more money than we could really use in such a short period of time. The program grew quite rapidly. We eventually got assistance from the Department of Defense as well. We got a couple of C-5s a month, a couple of C-141s a month, with all kinds of wonderful things that the Mujahideen could do. They were not covert military-related things, but they were things that could be used for humanitarian purposes. The AIG was formed roughly 2 years after I got there, the Afghan interim government. I did not rent the building that they were initially in. The other agency did that, but my office supplied it with everything to make it look like it really was an Afghan interim government office. All of the machines that were in the night and make things happen were all there in great abundance. And we started going there. I started steering journalists to go there and look for people to talk to and write stories about. Then I talked to the first president. His name is Sibghatullah Mojadidi, and I said, "Look, we've got to get some ministries set up here, so I'm willing to rent as many buildings as you want and staff them the same way that I've staffed your office here, but I want a Ministry of Finance right off the bat, Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Education, et cetera, et cetera." And he said, "Okay, I've got a good agriculture officer for you right now. He's my deputy." And he called him in. He's a guy who went to an ag school in Tennessee. I can't remember which one, but spoke great English, knew agriculture well. And he said, "He's the new Minister of Agriculture." He said, "I just decided." I said, "Well, let me decide who the Ministry of Finance should be." He said, "Okay, you decide." I said, "That should be Hidayat Arsalah." He was a former World Bank loan officer who had left his job at the World Bank to come out and help out with the war. I said, "Hidayat understands these things. He knows how to put a Ministry of Finance together, and let's make him the Minister of Finance." They said, "Okay." Hidayat and I went on to become great friends, by the way, over the years. Well, that's sort of how we began the whole process in short form of putting together a government in exile. That government lasted until 1990, roughly, with a number of different presidents. Mojadidi was the first, as I mentioned. And in '89, the chief of station called me to his office and said, "Larry, read this." It was a cable he had just gotten, where it was said that Gorbachev had just agreed that he was going to withdraw all his troops from Afghanistan and do it as quickly as possible, but he only wanted one thing in return, that we would not cause problems for his convoys and whatnot as they started heading north back to the Soviet Union. "Leave them alone," he said, "and it will go quickly and efficiently." And he said, we can make that, we on our side, said we'll do everything in our power to make that happen. And we did. So they left. At that point, the ambassador was Bob Oakley, and Bob and I worked very closely together, and we got together one night at his place, and we were talking, and I said, "Bob, I deal with these guys every day in depth, and I know that once the Soviets leave, and if we leave them too, not as overnight the way the Soviets are doing, but if we just leave them and they know we're leaving them high and dry, it will cause more chaos than you could ever imagine. We cannot let that happen." He said, "Okay, let's start hitting Washington with that idea." I drafted the first cable. He fussed with it a bit, and we sent it back. And we got a thank you note, basically, in return. What we learned was that the then President Bush, who had taken over from Reagan, had been left out of many of the important discussions about the war in Afghanistan while he was vice president in the Reagan administration. And he therefore had little to no knowledge of the war and what the complications were with it. And when he learned that the Soviets were leaving, he basically said, okay, we're washing our hands of this mess. The war is over, at least for us. What Bob and I argued was the war was just beginning for the Afghans, and if we leave them high and dry, then all hell will break loose in that country. The details are of book length, but that is in fact what happened. By 1993, the Afghans had proven that they could not govern in Kabul, even though they managed to leave or to capture the Soviet left behind president, took him out of a UN compound and hanged him on a nearby pole. Right after that, the 7 parties that we supported were just at each other's throats day in and day out. It was chaotic as hell. That led to the rise of the Taliban. The Taliban, and Pushtu means students. It's a plural form. Talib is the singular form. The Taliban referred to young men who said, these nutcases in Kabul don't know how to run anything. We got to get organized and see if we can figure out how to do it better. Books have been written about this, but suffice it to say, the Taliban did win out. And what happened was the ISI, not wanting to be left out, the Pakistan Intelligence Service, agreed to help organize and support the Taliban, and did so for many years. My guess is they're still doing so to this day, but I don't want to say so. Okay, come to 9/11, we all know what happened, and I'm not going to bore everybody with well-known details. But we did go back in there in a big way with, first with our special forces and other folks with them. And then, of course, we built up to a very large contingent at its peak. But what's important to remember about this country is starting, as I said, in 1974 with the overthrow of the king, 1979 with the invasion of the Soviets, the departure of the Soviets in 1989, and our leaving the Mujahideen that had come to trust us implicitly because of the close work that we had done with them. We left them high and dry about 92, 93 period, and left a lot of very significant ill will behind in the process. And that led to, as I said, the rise of the Taliban and their alliance with a certain fellow by the name of bin Laden and his organization called Al-Qaeda. There were other groups like Al-Qaeda as well, but they were not nearly as successful. The Al-Qaeda is the one that we all tend to focus on. When I hear people on TV from various places seemingly in the know say, you know, we've been involved with Afghanistan for 17, 18 years. It's time for us to leave and leave the Afghans to their own devices. I get very upset because they have been going through this for more than 40 years. Their country has been traumatized with nationwide warfare for over 40 years, part of which we have contributed to be sure, in terms of political chaos when we left them high and dry after the Soviets left, and then later the military chaos that we introduced after 9/11. And we're supposed to walk away from that after 40-some years. I don't think that's highly advisable. There's likely to be a repeat of what happened in the early 90s when we walked away from our Mujahideen comrades and all hell broke loose. I'll stop there.